The air in Sunder Ridge didn't breathe, it settled. It was thick with the scent of pine, wet decay, and an underlying cold that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the cold of forgotten iron and buried stone, a primal chill that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Elias Vance hadn't intended to come back. Not after 20 years, and certainly not to stand on the warped porch of the cabin where his father, Silas, had met his end. Silas Vance was the third person to disappear or die violently in this isolated Appalachian community over the last 18 months. The local sheriff, a man named Harlan Boone, whose official report Elias knew to be a lie, had ruled Silas's death a likely tragic fall down the eastern slope. Elias knew better. His father never did anything likely. Silas, a stubborn amateur folklorist, knew the ridge line better than the lines on his own worn hands. Elias shoved the heavy, brass key into the lock. The tumblers groaned, resisting, before finally giving way with a sound like a coffin lid scraping shut. The cabin's interior was untouched, preserved in the stale, amber light of his father's final days. Hand-drawn maps, annotated with cryptic symbols and dates, were pinned everywhere. They weren't maps of roads or property lines. They were maps of old hunting trails, abandoned mine shafts, and streams named after dead spirits. They were marked with red circles and black, hastily scrawled notes. Hollow Man, cold spot, where the singing stopped. A layer of gray dust coated everything except for the small, circular area on the floor directly beneath the hanging kerosene lamp. It was here, in the cabin's center, that Silas had done his most recent, desperate work. Elias knelt, brushing the dust away. In the cleared pine boards, Silas had etched a complex symbol, a weave of 3 interlocking triangles, pointed sharply inwards, surrounding a deeply carved, single line that bisected the whole design. It looked less like research and more like a warning, or perhaps a desperate prayer. He was scared, Elias whispered to the empty room. He found his father's latest journal on the cluttered desk. The spine cracked open, revealing pages filled with Silas's tight, looping handwriting. Most of it was rambling local gossip, but 2 weeks before his death, the tone shifted abruptly. They are taking the wood. They are cutting too deep. The roots know the score. When the soil is turned, what sleeps beneath will wake. The ridge isn't a place. It's a door. The final entry was short, jagged, and almost illegible. June 14th. Wind stopped. Only the humming. It wants what was taken. The blood debt must be paid in full. Told Harlan, useless, fat fool. He told me to stop asking about the Oakhaven lot. The well, the entry stopped mid-sentence. Elias knew the Oakhaven lot. It was a parcel of land deep in the national forest, traditionally avoided by locals, whispered to be the site of a mass grave. 2 months ago, Sheriff Boone and the county had approved a permit for a new, small-scale luxury resort development there. The other 2 victims, a young hiker named Sarah Jensen, and an elderly recluse named Thomas Cole, had both been seen near the Oakhaven boundary in the days leading up to their own fatal accidents. Elias managed to catch a single bar of cell service by the window and Googled the location. The search results were boilerplate county zoning maps. Then, he found an archival news clipping from 1957. Smallpox panic shuts down Sunder Ridge mine. The caption identified the location as the old Oakhaven mining claim. But Silas and the locals always said that mine was abandoned due to flooding, not disease. The map Silas had drawn, centered precisely on the Oakhaven lot, was filled with notes about the Hollow Man. The next morning, Elias drove into town. Sunder Ridge was a skeleton of a town. 1 main street, a diner, a post office, and the sheriff's station. Sheriff Harlan Boone was a man whose girth strained his uniform and whose eyes held the weary, guarded look of someone who had seen too much, or More likely, covered up just enough. Elias Vance, Boone said, leaning back in his chair, making the cheap wood squeak. Thought you wouldn't darken our doorstep again. Your daddy's affairs are wrapped up. Everything points to a tragedy. Mountain can be unforgiving, son. My father wrote about the Oakhaven lot right before he died. He said the blood debt must be paid. He mentioned a humming sound and you told him to stop asking questions. Elias placed the journal on the desk. Boone's easy smile evaporated. Silas got fanciful toward the end. Started talking about spirits and old gods. I told him to stick to his folk tales and leave county business alone. That land is going to bring prosperity. You got any proof of foul play, or just a lunatic's ramblings? Sarah Jensen and Thomas Cole both died near that lot, Elias countered. Accidents. They strayed off marked trails. This mountain is old, Elias. It has its own schedule. Boone stood, placing both hands on the desk. I understand you're grieving, but you leave this alone. You start sniffing around the Oakhaven development, you'll find yourself in the way of progress. Or worse, finding out how unforgiving the mountain can be. Dismissed and threatened, Elias left. He went straight to the tiny, damp library. The elderly librarian, Maeve, a woman with the deep-set eyes and dry hands of someone who had lived on the ridge forever, was an old friend of Silas's. Harlan Boone is a fool who only sees what's printed on a dollar bill, Maeve murmured, sliding a brittle, unmarked text across the counter. Silas gave me this 20 years ago, told me to hold it if he ever went quiet. The book was titled Stone and Shadow, Unofficial Histories of the Ridge. In it, Silas had underlined a passage describing the Sunder Ridge Walker, a regional name for a localized phenomenon. It wasn't a ghost, but an ancient presence tied to the deepest ore veins of the mountain. It wasn't violent, but psychological. The Sunder, the text claimed, takes not the body, but the mind, instilling such utter, profound despair that the victim seeks the deepest silence. It drove people to their own destruction, making it look like an accident. The Sunder doesn't kill, Maeve said, her voice barely a whisper. It drives you to kill yourself. And it only wakes when the ground is disturbed, when the stone is turned. The Oakhaven mine, Elias realized. The digging woke it up. Maeve nodded grimly. That mine was sealed for a reason in 57. Not smallpox. They hit something, and it started. The old families covered it with the disease story and locked it down. Silas was trying to warn them they were opening the lock again. Elias hiked the next morning, cutting through dense rhododendron thickets to avoid the main logging roads. He reached the perimeter of the Oakhaven lot. Freshly painted orange ribbons marked the new boundary. He found an abandoned surveyor's tripod leaning against a massive, moss-covered outcrop. Following a faint trail Silas must have used, he discovered a small, hidden cistern, a dry, brick-lined well choked with nettles. Kneeling down, Elias pulled the weeds back. Etched deep into the stone rim was the interlocking triangle symbol, the exact same lock his father had carved on the cabin floor. This was the center point, the nexus Silas was worried about. As Elias reached for his phone to photograph the symbol, the single bar of service he had fought for dropped dead. A profound, unnatural silence fell over the woods. The wind stopped. Even the insects seemed to hold their breath. Then, he heard it. It wasn't loud, but it was massive, deep, and rhythmic. A sound like a heartbeat made of stone, or a distant, steady pneumatic drill. A profound, low-frequency thump-thump-thump that vibrated not through the air, but through his bones. The humming. Elias stumbled back, the hair on his arms standing straight up. He waited, shivering, until the sound receded, replaced by the normal sounds of the forest. He hurried back down the ridge, his mind racing. The 3 victims were linked by location and the mountain's psychic influence. Now, he had the symbol, the lock, and the humming. But what was the blood debt? He spent the next 2 days poring over old county records, confirming the 1957 closure was an emergency health measure, which Maeve had dismissed as a lie. But buried in the tax archive, Elias found a deed. The original Oakhaven land was held by a handful of families who sold the mining rights for almost nothing in 1955, then bought them back for an exorbitant sum in 1957, immediately after the smallpox scare. And listed among the current, silent partners in the new luxury resort development was Harlan Boone, sheriff of Sunder Ridge, heir to one of the original 1957 families. Boone wasn't just corrupt, he was financially and ancestrally tied to the original cover-up. He wasn't protecting the town's interest, he was protecting his own inheritance and a terrible secret. That night, the Sunder came for Elias. He lay awake in the cabin, trying to parse Silas's scattered notes, when the familiar, ambient fear of the old woods turned clinical. It felt like an intrusive thought, a profound sense of failure and emptiness that clamped down on his chest. Why are you here? You abandoned him. You are worthless. The air grew colder, and the faint scent of sulfur and wet earth permeated the room. He saw it in a sudden, cold flash, a phantom memory, not his own. He was standing in a mine shaft, the air thick with dust and the smell of fear. He felt the overwhelming urge to lie down, to stop fighting, to let the weight of the stone above him silence the pain. Elias recognized the sheer, paralyzing terror in the vision. It was the fear Silas felt in his final moments. The Sunder was trying to wear him down, preparing him for his fall. He fought it, clinging to the cold brass key in his hand, focusing on the symbol Silas etched. The triangles were meant to contain something. The single line bisecting it was a break. Silas hadn't carved a lock to keep something out. He had carved a lock to keep something in. He needed to get back to the well. He needed to understand what the mountain was hiding, and why the victims were being taken. He returned to the hidden cistern, his heart pounding not from effort, but from the mounting dread. The rhythmic humming was barely perceptible, a deep bass note in the atmosphere. He found fresh tracks around the well. Not Boone's heavy boot, but something smoother, less defined, like a large, heavy sack had been dragged. Elias secured his flashlight to a length of rope and lowered it into the shaft. The well wasn't dry at all. The light cut through the gloom, revealing water, dark, stagnant, oily water, at the bottom. The depth was alarming. And there, partially submerged in the opaque water, was a boot. A modern, leather hiking boot, brightly colored, unmistakable. Sarah Jensen's. The Sunder wasn't driving people to kill themselves and letting them lie on the ground. It was driving them to kill themselves and then taking them to a specific place. The well was a collection point, a mouth. Elias pulled the rope back up, shivering violently despite the sweat running down his back. The journal's final entry echoed. The well. He grabbed the remaining pages of Silas's scattered map, which he had now pieced together. The center of the hollow man drawing, the main circle, wasn't the well. The well was merely a marker. The center was further up the slope, at the epicenter of the Oakhaven development site. The original mine entrance. Elias had one advantage. His father had taught him the ridge's true language, the shortcuts, the places the deer avoided, the old surveyor's lines. He used an almost forgotten logging trail to climb the final rise, slipping past the main access road. When he broke through the tree line, he stopped, stunned. The Oakhaven lot was a moonscape. Bulldozers, backhoes, and heavy drills sat abandoned around a deep, muddy trench. And in the center of the trench, the site of the original 1957 mine seal, a massive iron-reinforced concrete plug, had been brutally dynamited open. The developers had found the seal, assumed it was blocking prime ore, and blasted it wide. Elias ran down the slope, plunging through the mud. The exposed mine entrance was a black, jagged maw, venting cold, mineral-rich air. He looked inside, flashlight beam cutting into the darkness. He saw rusted track lines, collapsed timber supports, and deeper in, a horrifying glint of something pale. He understood the Sunder now. It wasn't a ghost. It was the vast, geological horror of the mountain itself, perhaps a semi-sentient, mineral-based entity, a pressure of raw, terrifying despair that resided in the deep ore veins. The sealing in 1957 wasn't to prevent smallpox from getting out. It was to prevent the mountain's terror from getting out. The blood debt was the old mountain family's ritual. Perhaps they had sacrificed livestock, or even human victims, generations ago, to appease the entity and keep it dormant. The developers' explosives had ripped the lock open, and the Sunder was now flooding the ridge with pure dread, driving its victims to its mouth. Elias. The voice was Harlan Boone's, thick with rage and panic. He was cresting the rise, flanked by a single, expensive suited figure, the lead developer, a man Elias recognized from a small-town newspaper photo. "You son of a bitch," Boone spat, drawing a heavy hunting rifle. "You were supposed to be gone. You saw that journal. That journal dies here, and so do you. You opened the door, Harlan," Elias said, stepping toward the open mine shaft. "The mine was sealed because of what was inside." "Nonsense. That was a lie to hide the ore vein. We own this land, and it's going to make me rich. Get away from the edge." The developer, meanwhile, was starting to hyperventilate. His eyes were wide, darting everywhere. He wasn't looking at Elias or Boone. He was staring into the woods, hands clamped over his ears. The rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the humming returned, louder than before, vibrating through the muddy ground. "Shut up! Shut up!" the developer screamed, backing away from Boone. He was shaking violently, the sound of the Sunder breaking his mind. "It wants us to stop. It wants the silence." He spun, dropping his expensive radio. He stumbled toward the black opening of the mine, his face a mask of terror and sudden, blissful resignation. "Silence," he whispered, and plunged into the abyss. Boone, shocked, fired the rifle wildly into the air. "Idiot! Get back here!" The chaos was Elias's chance. He tackled Boone, the two men tumbling in the cold, wet mud. The rifle skittered away. Boone was stronger, driven by panic and greed, but Elias was driven by a cold, righteous fear. He wrestled free, scrambling toward the nearest piece of heavy equipment, a massive, idling excavator. He knew the basics from years ago working summers with his uncle. He slammed the door shut, hitting the ignition. The powerful engine roared, drowning out the humming for a brief, glorious second. Boone was lumbering toward him, his face a furious mask of mud and disbelief. "What are you doing?" Elias ignored him. He found the controls, the twin joysticks that governed the mighty boom and bucket. He pivoted the machine, the treads tearing up the mud. He swung the massive steel bucket towards a fresh pile of boulders and debris the developers had set aside. The lock must be shut. The silence must be contained. He dug the bucket deep into the pile, lifted a massive load of rock and earth, and with a guttural scream of effort, swung the boom and slammed the load straight into the jagged, open mouth of the mine. The impact was tremendous. The earth shuddered. Dust exploded upward, mingling with the dense, cold air from the shaft. Elias repeated the action, again and again, burying the open mine shaft under tons of rock, concrete rubble, and mud. Finally, the black maw was gone, replaced by a fresh, chaotic mound of earth. And the humming stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound had been. It was absolute, immediate, and terrifyingly fragile. Elias climbed out of the excavator, the silence ringing in his ears. Boone lay in the mud, stunned and weeping, the sheer psychological pressure of the Sunder's retreat leaving him a broken shell. Elias looked at the buried mine. He hadn't destroyed the Sunder. He had merely replaced the lock, bought them time. He used Boone's discarded radio to call the state police in the nearest county, anonymously reporting a catastrophic industrial accident involving a sealed, abandoned mine and a corrupt sheriff. He gave them the coordinates and the name of the missing developer. He didn't mention the Sunder Ridge walker or the blood debt. They wouldn't have believed him. By the time the state police arrived, Elias was gone, using the same hidden trail to walk back down the ridge. He stopped only to retrieve his father's journal and the heavy, brass key from the cabin. Sheriff Harlan Boone was led away in handcuffs, his face gray with defeat, his inheritance, and his lie, exposed. The Oakhaven development was immediately halted, the site sealed off by the state as a protected hazard zone. The cover-up of 1957 was finally uncovered, revealing not just a mass poisoning, but the deliberate, terrified sealing of an environmental evil. Elias didn't stay for the winter. He drove away from Sunder Ridge the next day, the small town already beginning to feel the chill of the mountain's new, sullen peace. He never showed anyone the etched symbol on the floor of the cabin, which was eventually condemned and boarded up. He kept the journal in a fireproof safe, its pages holding the key to a truth the modern world was not prepared to hear. The Sunder had only been momentarily starved of the terror it required to grow. It was vast, ancient, and patient. As he drove south, away from the granite heights, Elias kept his hand resting on the radio dial, listening to the static between stations. He was always half expecting the static to resolve itself into a low, deep, rhythmic thump, signaling that the mountain had finally shifted the boulders, and the door was opening once more. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that Sunder Ridge would only be quiet until the next time the digging started. And that one day, he would have to return. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment and turn on notifications if you enjoyed the video so you never miss an upload.